I should have been dead. Seat 23A, Flight 447 to Seattle, February 14th, 2019, Valentine's Day. Though love was the last thing on my mind as I stood in that departure gate, clutching a one-way ticket and a duffel bag containing everything I owned. What I was thinking about was escape. From the shouting matches that had become our family dinners. From my father's voice telling me I'd never amount to anything, just like your mother. From the crushing weight of being the disappointment he'd been expecting since the day I was born. But sometimes your feet know things your brain doesn't. I made it all the way to the boarding line. Watched 185 strangers shuffle past me onto that plane, chatting about weekend plans and business meetings they'd never attend. The flight attendant smiled at me, that practiced, tired smile, and reached for my boarding pass. That's when it happened. My hand wouldn't move. My legs felt like concrete. 23 years old, and I was frozen like a scared kid. "Sir, your boarding pass?" I mumbled something about forgetting my phone charger and stepped out of line. Watched the gate close. Watched Flight 447 push back from the terminal. 3 hours later, I was lying on my childhood bed, the same Spider-Man sheets from when I was 12 because we couldn't afford new ones, when my phone started buzzing with news alerts. Breaking, commercial flight crashes shortly after takeoff. No survivors. 186 people gone. The empty seat that should have been mine. You want to know what survivor's guilt feels like? It's not dramatic or cinematic. It's waking up every morning knowing that 186 families are planning funerals while you're brushing your teeth. It's wondering if the man in seat 23B had kids, if the woman across the aisle ever got to tell her daughter she loved her one more time. It's the crushing realization that you're alive not because you're special, but because you were too broken to get on a plane. But here's what they don't tell you about second chances. They come with a price. Because when the universe saves your life, it expects you to do something with it. And sometimes, the very thing you're running from becomes the only thing worth living for. My name is Marcus, and this is the story of how missing the worst flight of my life led me to discover the best parts of myself. How 186 strangers I never met taught me what it means to be alive, and how the family I thought I hated became the reason I'm sitting here today, 5 years later, finally ready to tell you what really happened in the days after Flight 447. If you've ever felt like you don't deserve the life you have, if you've ever wondered why bad things happen to good people while you keep getting lucky breaks you didn't earn, this story is for you. Because what I learned isn't just about surviving, it's about what you do with the life you're given when everyone else's was taken away. Hit that like button if you've ever felt like an imposter in your own story. Subscribe, because over the next 10 chapters, I'm going to take you through every brutal, beautiful moment of what came next. And I promise you, the ending will surprise even me. Trust me, you need to hear what happens when you're supposed to die, but don't. The first thing they don't tell you about survivor's guilt is how it changes the way you breathe. 3 days after Flight 447 went down, I was sitting in Dr. Martinez's office, a crisis counselor the airline had assigned to affected individuals, and I couldn't fill my lungs properly. Each breath felt stolen from someone who deserved it. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and spoke in that practiced, gentle tone that mental health professionals perfect in graduate school. "Marcus, you need to understand that what you're experiencing is completely normal." Normal? There was nothing normal about being alive when 186 people weren't. I told her about the dreams, how I saw their faces every night, faces I'd never actually seen, but my mind had constructed anyway. The businessman in 23B who'd been checking his phone one last time. The elderly woman in 24A who'd smiled at me in the boarding area. The teenager with headphones who'd rolled her eyes at her mother's worry about turbulence. Dr. Martinez nodded and scribbled notes. She asked about my family, my support system. I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised us both. Support system? My father hadn't called once since the news broke. My sister, Emma, had sent exactly 3 text messages. Heard about the plane. You okay? Followed by, good, when I'd responded, and then radio silence. The worst part wasn't the guilt, though. It was the relief. Because somewhere in the darkest corner of my heart, I was grateful. Grateful that I'd been too broken, too cowardly, too pathetic to get on that plane. And the shame of that gratitude was eating me alive. Dr. Martinez handed me a tissue I didn't realize I needed. Survivor's guilt often manifests as a form of magical thinking, she explained. You believe your presence on that flight could have changed the outcome. But she was wrong. I didn't think I could have saved them. I thought I should have died with them. That night, I couldn't sleep on the Spider-Man sheets that now felt like a monument to my failure to launch. Instead, I sat at my laptop and did what every millennial does when they can't process trauma. I researched. Flight manifests aren't public, but the internet is forever, and grief makes people share everything. I found their names, their faces, their stories. Jennifer Walsh, 34, marketing executive, flying home to surprise her daughter for Valentine's Day. David Kim, 28, software engineer, moving to Seattle for his dream job at Microsoft. Sarah and Tom Bradley, married for 43 years, finally taking that second honeymoon they'd always talked about. Each name was a weight added to my chest. Each story was a life unlived. Each face was a reminder that the universe had made a terrible mistake in letting me walk away from that gate. By dawn, I'd memorized all 186 names. I'd read every obituary I could find. I'd studied their photos until their faces replaced the fictional ones in my dreams. The question that haunted me wasn't why I'd survived. It was what the hell I was supposed to do with a life that didn't belong to me. The memorial service was held at St. Mary's Cathedral downtown, 6 days after the crash. I hadn't planned to go. How do you show up to mourn people you'd abandoned? But Emma texted me that morning, the first real message she'd sent since the accident. Dad's going. Says the family should be represented since you were supposed to be on that flight. Wear the black suit. The black suit. The one we'd bought for Mom's funeral 8 years ago when I was 15 and still growing out of my sleeves every few months. It barely fit now. The jacket tight across my shoulders, the pants an inch too short. Perfect metaphor for my life. Always slightly wrong, never quite fitting where I was supposed to be. The cathedral was packed. I slipped in through a side entrance, keeping my head down, and found a spot in the back corner. The families sat in the front rows, their grief palpable even from a distance. Real grief, the kind that comes from actual loss, not the twisted survivor's remorse that had taken up residence in my chest. Father McKenna spoke about God's plan, about how sometimes we can't understand why tragedy strikes. Behind me, someone sobbed. To my left, a woman clutched a photo of a young man who looked barely older than me. Probably her son, probably someone who'd had his whole life ahead of him. That's when I saw my father. He was 3 rows up, his graying head bowed, his shoulders set in that familiar line of disappointment. Even here, surrounded by genuine mourning, he looked like he was enduring rather than grieving. When he finally turned to scan the crowd, probably looking for me, our eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. His expression didn't change. He simply turned back around. The bishop invited anyone who wanted to share memories to come forward. A parade of broken people told stories about daughters who loved painting, fathers who coached Little League, mothers who sang in church choirs. Each testimony was a knife twist, a reminder of all the love and potential that had been erased in 4 minutes of mechanical failure. Then Jennifer Walsh's 7-year-old daughter, Katie, took the microphone. She was wearing a pink dress with a bow that kept slipping, and she kept adjusting it while she talked. "My mommy was coming home to make me heart pancakes for Valentine's Day," she whispered into the microphone. "She always made them in the shape of hearts. She said I was her heart." That's when I broke. I pushed through the crowd, stumbling over feet and whispered apologies, and burst through the cathedral doors into the cold February air. The guilt wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, and a pink dress, and a bow that wouldn't stay straight. It had a voice that would never again hear "I love you" from the person who mattered most. I threw up in the bushes next to the church steps. Then I called an Uber and went home to my childhood bedroom, where I pulled those damn Spider-Man sheets over my head and sobbed until my ribs ached. That night, I started writing letters I'd never send, one to each family. Apologies I could never deliver for a crime I'd never committed. The worst kind of confession, admitting to surviving when their loved ones couldn't. Numbers became my obsession. 186 passengers, 15 crew members, 201 total souls lost, 4 minutes and 23 seconds from takeoff to impact, 847 feet altitude when the left engine failed. These statistics felt safer than names, cleaner than faces. Math doesn't cry. Data doesn't ask why you're still breathing when it's not. I'd been back at my part-time job at Henderson Electronics for exactly 11 days when Mr. Henderson called me into his office. The store smelled like dust and broken dreams. Fitting, since that's exactly what I was becoming. He was a decent man who'd given me work when nobody else would hire, a college dropout with a patchy resume and visible anxiety issues. "Marcus, I don't know what happened to you, son, but you're scaring the customers."
I'd been helping an elderly woman find batteries for her hearing aids when she'd mentioned her granddaughter was flying to Portland that weekend. The panic attack hit like a freight train. I'd dropped an entire display of phone chargers, hyperventilating while she tried to calm me down. Security footage probably made it look like I was having some kind of breakdown, which technically I was. Mr. Henderson's face was kind but tired. "Maybe you should take some more time off. Get yourself sorted out." More time off meant more time alone with the numbers, more time researching the families I'd never meet. I'd started following their social media accounts, not interacting, just watching their grief play out in real time. Jennifer Walsh's husband posting photos of Katie's drawings, all hearts and rainbows, and "I miss mommy" written in purple crayon. David Kim's parents sharing memories of their son's first programming competition. The Bradley family's grown children planning a memorial garden with 43 roses, one for each year of their parents' marriage. I was becoming a professional mourner for people who'd never known I existed. The check from the airline arrived on a Thursday. Compensation for emotional distress and travel inconvenience, the letter said. $2,000 for almost dying. It felt like blood money. Payment for surviving when I shouldn't have. I stared at that check for 3 hours, paralyzed by the implications of cashing it. That afternoon, I drove to Katie Walsh's elementary school. Not to approach her, I wasn't that far gone, but I sat in my car across the street and watched children stream out of the building, their backpacks bouncing, their voices bright with after-school freedom. A little girl in a pink coat ran toward a sedan where a woman waited. Not Jennifer. Never Jennifer again. An aunt, maybe, or a grandmother.
someone filling a hole that could never be properly filled. The little girl got in the car and they drove away, and I cried until my throat hurt. Dr. Martinez had warned me about this. Survivors often develop what we call witnessing behaviors, she'd explained in our last session before I'd stopped going. The need to see the ongoing impact of the tragedy, to somehow participate in the grief you feel you don't deserve to have. She was right, of course. But knowing the clinical term for your breakdown doesn't make it hurt less. How far would you go to understand grief you feel you don't deserve to have? 3 weeks after the crash, I started building a shrine. Not intentionally. It began with just printing out the passenger manifest, wanting to see all 186 names on paper instead of glowing on my laptop screen. But paper felt insufficient for the weight of what I was carrying, so I printed their photos too. Then their obituaries. Then news articles about the investigation.
My childhood bedroom walls were covered in Spider-Man posters until I was 16, when Mom got sick and redecorating seemed trivial compared to chemo schedules and insurance battles. Now, those faded superhero faces were hidden behind a mosaic of the dead. 160 strangers looking down at me while I slept, or tried to sleep, on sheets that felt more like a shroud every night. Emma found it when she came by to pick up the mail Dad had been ignoring. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, that familiar pattern from when we were kids, and she'd sneak up to tell me about her day after particularly bad fights downstairs. But this time, when she opened my door, she gasped like she'd walked into a crime scene. Jesus, Marcus, what is this? I was sitting on my bed, cross-legged like I was meditating, staring at Jennifer Walsh's photo. Katie had her mother's eyes. The same bright green, the same laugh lines around the corners. It's them, I said, simply. All of them. Emma stepped into the room slowly, like she was afraid sudden movements might set me off. Her gaze moved from face to face, taking in the scope of my obsession. This isn't healthy. Healthy? I laughed, but it sounded more like a bark. None of this is healthy. None of this should have happened. They should be alive, and I should be dead. And instead, I'm sitting here in my childhood bedroom, playing house with ghosts. She sat on the edge of my bed, carefully, like I was made of glass that might shatter. For a moment, we were kids again. Emma, 2 years older and infinitely wiser, trying to make sense of our family's latest crisis. Marcus, you can't live like this. Live? The word felt foreign in my mouth. I'm not living. I'm existing. There's a difference. She picked up one of the articles I'd printed. Something about the investigation. Mechanical failure, nobody's fault. You know it wasn't your fault, right? You know missing that flight doesn't make you responsible for what happened to these people. But that was the problem. Logic didn't matter when guilt had rewired your brain. I could understand intellectually that engine failures and metal fatigue and manufacturer defects had nothing to do with a 23-year-old college dropout who was too scared to board a plane. Understanding and feeling were different countries, and I was trapped in the one where survivor's guilt spoke the only language I could hear.
I keep thinking about parallel universes, I told Emma. In some other timeline, I got on that plane. I died with them. And in that universe, maybe the weight distribution was different by just enough that they made it. Maybe my extra 160 pounds was the difference between catastrophic failure and a rough landing everyone walked away from. Emma was crying now. Quiet tears that she wiped away quickly, like she didn't want to add her grief to my collection. That's not how planes work, Marcus. That's not how any of this works. But she was wrong. In my world, everything worked exactly like that. Cause and effect twisted into impossible knots, where cowardice became culpability and survival became sin. I started writing the letters at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after the crash. The first one was to Jennifer Walsh, because Katie's face had been haunting my dreams. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. Dear Jennifer, you don't know me, but I was supposed to die with you. I was supposed to be in seat 23A, right across from where you were sitting with your Valentine's surprise for Katie. I keep thinking about how scared you must have been in those final moments, and I wonder if knowing someone nearby was thinking about your daughter would have brought you any comfort. Probably not. Probably nothing could have helped. I've been watching Katie from a distance, not in a creepy way. I'm not a monster, just a coward. I saw her at the school playground, and she still adjusts her hair bow the same way she did at your memorial service. Does she know how much you loved her? I hope she knows. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry you were alone. The second letter was to David Kim. I'd found his GitHub profile, saw the code he'd been working on right up until the day he died. Clean, elegant algorithms that made me wish I'd stuck with computer science instead of dropping out after 2 semesters of mediocrity. By sunrise, I'd written 17 letters. By the end of the week, I'd written to every passenger whose story I could piece together. The businessman who was flying to close a deal that would save his company. The college student visiting her boyfriend for the first time. The retired teacher who was finally taking that art class in Seattle she'd always talked about. Dr. Martinez called that Friday. I'd missed our last 3 appointments, and apparently the airline's insurance company was concerned about their liability. Marcus, I need you to come in. We need to talk about your coping mechanisms. I almost laughed. Coping mechanisms. Like writing apology letters to dead people was some kind of therapeutic breakthrough instead of a descent into madness? But I went anyway, mostly because refusing would have required more energy than I had. Her office smelled like vanilla candles and false hope. She'd moved the tissues closer to my chair, a professional adjustment based on our previous sessions.
Tell me about the letters, she said without preamble. I shouldn't have been surprised. In the age of digital surveillance, privacy was an illusion. Someone had been monitoring my internet activity, my research into the passengers, my obsessive documentation of their lives. They're private. Marcus, I'm worried about you. This level of preoccupation with the victims isn't healthy. It's preventing you from processing your own trauma, my own trauma. As if being too broken to board a plane qualified as trauma? As if my cowardice deserved the same clinical attention as actual loss, actual grief, actual death. What trauma? I asked. I didn't lose anyone. I didn't go through anything. I just didn't get on a plane. She leaned forward, her expression serious. Survivor's guilt is a form of post-traumatic stress. You experienced a life-threatening situation. I experienced being pathetic, I interrupted. The session ended with her prescribing medication I wouldn't take and scheduling appointments I wouldn't keep. But as I walked to my car, I realized something had shifted. The letters weren't just apologies anymore. They were becoming something else, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. That night, I wrote my longest letter yet. Not to a passenger, but to Flight 447 itself. To the metal and mechanics, the physics and fate, the split-second decisions and systemic failures that had chosen who lived and who died. What would you say to someone who died in your place? The investigation report was released 63 days after the crash. Catastrophic engine failure due to metal fatigue in a turbine blade manufactured 14 years ago. Nobody's fault, the investigators concluded. A confluence of age, stress cycles, and microscopic flaws that aligned in the worst possible way at the worst possible moment. I read all 847 pages twice. The families deserved answers, deserved someone to blame, deserved justice for their unimaginable loss.
Instead, they got bureaucratic language about acceptable risk parameters and statistical inevitabilities. The lawyers would file lawsuits against Boeing, the airline, the maintenance company. Everyone would settle out of court for undisclosed amounts. Money would change hands, but nothing would change the fundamental mathematics of tragedy. My father finally called that same week. Not to check on my mental health or offer support, but to discuss practical matters. Emma had apparently told him about the shrine in my room, and he was concerned about property values if I completely lost it and ended up in the news. "You need to get your shit together, Marcus," he said without preamble. "This whole feeling sorry for yourself routine is getting old." I was sitting in my car outside Katie Walsh's school again. Not my proudest moment, but the only place I felt connected to something larger than my own pathology. I'm not feeling sorry for myself. No? Then what do you call this obsession with people you never knew? This wallowing in guilt over something that had nothing to do with you? The thing about emotional abuse is that sometimes it sounds exactly like tough love. My father had perfected the art of cruelty disguised as concern, cutting you down while claiming he was trying to help you stand up. Maybe I call it caring about other people for once in my life. Caring? He laughed, but it wasn't funny. You're not caring about them, son. You're using their deaths to avoid dealing with your own life. It's selfish. The line went dead, and I sat in my car, watching children I'd never have, mourning people I'd never met, wondering if he was right. Was my grief performative? Was I using 186 deaths as an excuse to avoid the harder work of actually living? That night, I did something I'd been avoiding for 2 months. I called Emma back. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting. "Marcus? I think I'm losing my mind." "I know." Her voice was gentle, tired. "I've been waiting for you to realize it." We talked for 3 hours. About Mom's death, about Dad's emotional absence, about the weight of growing up in a house where love was conditional and disappointment was the default setting. About how I'd been running from that family dysfunction long before Flight 447, and how the plane crash had become a convenient way to avoid examining my own patterns of self-destruction. "You know what I think?" Emma said around midnight. "I think you survived that crash for a reason. Not some cosmic reason, not because the universe has plans for you, but because somewhere deep down you wanted to live. And now you have to figure out what to do with that." After we hung up, I stood in my room looking at the walls covered with faces. 186 people who'd wanted to live too, who'd gotten on a plane believing in tomorrows that never came. For the first time since the crash, I wondered if honoring their memory meant something more than drowning in guilt about surviving. Maybe it meant actually living. Dr. Sarah Chen wasn't like Dr. Martinez. She didn't have a vanilla-scented office or practiced therapeutic platitudes. Her waiting room smelled like coffee and had magazines from this decade. When Emma found her for me, after I'd agreed to try therapy one more time, Dr. Chen's first question wasn't about my feelings. It was about sleep. "When did you last sleep through the night?" I had to think about it. "Before February 14th. She nodded and wrote something down. Not judgment, just information. Trauma responses often manifest in sleep disruption first. Your nervous system is stuck in hypervigilance mode. "I don't have trauma," I said automatically. "I have guilt. Can you explain the difference?" It was a simple question that broke something loose in my chest, because the truth was, I couldn't. Somewhere in the months since the crash, guilt and trauma had become so entangled I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I started having panic attacks, I admitted, not just about flying, about everything. Leaving the house, being in crowds, sometimes just hearing airplane engines overhead. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. That sounds like trauma to me. We worked on breathing exercises. Seemed stupid at first. Wasn't breathing supposed to be automatic? But she explained how trauma changes your respiratory patterns, how anxiety literally steals oxygen from your brain. For weeks, I'd been suffocating myself with guilt and calling it grief. The first time I managed 6 deep breaths in a row without my chest tightening, I cried. Not the desperate sobbing I'd been doing for months, but quiet tears that felt like relief. I want you to try something, Dr. Chen said during our 4th session. I want you to pick one of those passengers, just one, and research their life, not their death. What did they love? What made them laugh? What were they proud of? I chose David Kim, partly because he'd been close to my age, partly because his code repositories were still public. I spent hours reading through his GitHub commits, seeing the evolution of his programming skills, the elegant solutions to complex problems. He'd been working on an app to help elderly people video chat with their grandchildren, something his own grandmother had inspired after she'd moved to assisted living. For the first time, David wasn't just a victim. He was a person who'd created things, who'd solved problems, who'd loved his grandmother enough to spend nights debugging video compression algorithms. He'd been brilliant and kind and alive in ways that had nothing to do with how he died. That night, I wrote David a different kind of letter. Not an apology, but a thank you. Thank you for showing me that programming could be about connection, not just code. Thank you for loving your grandmother. Thank you for existing in the world, even briefly, even ending too soon. The shrine on my walls started changing. Instead of obituaries and crash reports, I began printing photos of the passengers living. Jennifer teaching Katie to ride a bike. The elderly Bradley couple dancing at their anniversary party. David at his college graduation, his parents beaming beside him. Slowly, my room filled with life instead of death. It felt like learning to breathe all over again. The first time I went outside without panicking was April 23rd, exactly 68 days after the crash. Not counting trips to therapy or my voyeuristic drives past Katie's school, this was different. This was choosing to be in the world instead of just observing it from the edges. Emma had invited me to lunch at that little cafe downtown where we used to go with Mom during her treatment. Back then, those outings had felt forced, desperate attempts to maintain normalcy while cancer ate our mother alive. Now, sitting across from Emma with sunlight streaming through windows that didn't overlook a cemetery or a crash site, those memories seemed almost peaceful. "You look different," Emma said, studying my face over her coffee cup. I'd started showering regularly again, had gotten a haircut, had thrown away the black suit that had become like a hair shirt. Small changes, but visible ones. Dr. Chen says trauma recovery isn't linear. Some days are better than others. And today, I considered the question seriously. My chest wasn't tight. I wasn't counting emergency exits or calculating the statistical probability of the ceiling collapsing. Today, I'm having lunch with my sister. That feels like progress. Emma smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since the crash. Mom would have liked Dr. Chen. Yeah, she would have. Mom had always believed in addressing problems directly, without drama or self-pity. She'd faced cancer the way other people faced traffic jams, an inconvenience to be managed, not a tragedy to define her. If she'd lived to see my breakdown, she would have been kind but firm. Get help, do the work, stop wallowing. After lunch, Emma and I walked through downtown.
Nothing dramatic happened, no breakthrough moments or epiphanies. But I noticed things I'd been blind to for months. The way afternoon light hit the courthouse steps. How a street musician's guitar case had filled with dollar bills and smiles. A young couple arguing near the bus stop, then laughing, then kissing. Their whole relationship playing out in 30 seconds of public theater. Life was happening everywhere, and for the first time since February, I was part of it. That evening, I did something I'd been building courage to do for weeks. I called Jennifer Walsh's sister, Amy, who'd been handling media inquiries for the family. I'd found her number through my obsessive research, but I'd never used it. "This is Amy. Hi, my name is Marcus Rivera. I was supposed to be on Flight 447. Silence. Then, "The survivor?" The word hit like a physical blow. I'd never heard myself described that way, as the survivor, like I was some kind of statistical anomaly or medical miracle. I don't know if I'd call myself. "What do you want?" Her voice was careful, not hostile, but not welcoming. "I wanted to tell you about Katie. I've been watching her sometimes. Not in a scary way, just I needed to see that she was okay. And she is. She's beautiful and strong, and she has her mother's eyes." Amy was quiet for a long time. "You've been watching my niece?" I know how it sounds, but I couldn't stop thinking about her, about what Jennifer would want for her. I wrote letters to your sister, to Katie, to all of them. Letters I never sent, because what right did I have? But I needed you to know that someone was thinking about them, about her. You need help. Not cruel, just factual. This isn't healthy for you or for our family. She was right, of course. But something had shifted during that phone call. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of 186 deaths like they belonged to me. But they didn't. Their grief belonged to people like Amy, who loved them and missed them and had to figure out how to live without them. My job wasn't to carry their sorrow. It was to honor their lives by actually living mine. The forgiveness didn't come all at once. It came in small, unexpected moments over the next several months. Like when I realized I'd gone an entire day without thinking about the crash. Or when I caught myself laughing at something Emma said and didn't immediately feel guilty about experiencing joy while 186 families were still grieving. By summer, I'd moved out of my childhood bedroom and into a studio apartment across town. Nothing fancy, just 400 square feet with a kitchenette and windows that faced east, so I could watch sunrises instead of dwelling in darkness. The walls were blank white instead of covered in memorial photos. It felt like breathing room. I'd started working again, too, not at Henderson Electronics, but at a small nonprofit that provided technology support for senior citizens. The irony wasn't lost on me. David Kim's app idea, the one he'd been developing to help elderly people connect with family, had inspired me to find work that felt meaningful instead of just necessary. Every time I helped someone figure out video calls with their grandchildren, I thought about David, not about his death, but about his life, about the problems he'd tried to solve. Dr. Chen and I were working on what she called meaning making, the process of finding purpose in traumatic experiences. Not because trauma happens for a reason, she was careful to explain, but because humans need to create meaning in order to heal. "Tell me about your relationship with guilt now," she said during one of our sessions. I thought about it. It's still there. I don't think it'll ever completely go away, but it's different now. Quieter, like background noise instead of a fire alarm. Can you describe the difference? Before, the guilt was about surviving when they didn't. Now, it's more about what I do with the fact that I survived. Does that make sense? Dr. Chen nodded. That sounds like guilt transforming into responsibility. Survivor's guilt often evolves that way, from why me to now what. The now what was becoming clearer.
I'd started volunteering at the children's hospital where Katie Walsh was receiving grief counseling. Not to see her, Amy had made it clear that any contact with their family was inappropriate, but because I'd learned that 47 other children had lost parents in the crash. 47 kids who needed someone to read to them, to help with homework, to just be present while they processed their own version of loss. I wasn't trying to replace anyone's parent or ease my own conscience. I was just trying to be useful in a world that had too much senseless loss already. The first time I read to the grief counseling group a story about a brave little mouse who learned to be okay with being different, 8-year-old Connor asked me why I was there. Because I almost died in the same accident that killed your dad, I told him honestly. Kids deserve honesty, especially kids dealing with death. And I wanted to do something that might help.
Are you sad you didn't die? The question hit like a punch, but it was fair. Sometimes, but mostly I'm grateful I get to meet kids like you. Connor thought about this seriously, the way children consider important matters. My counselor says sometimes bad things happen for no reason, but we can still choose to do good things after. Out of the mouths of babes, this 8-year-old had articulated what I'd been struggling to understand for 8 months. 1 year later, I was standing in the same departure gate where I'd frozen exactly 365 days before. Not because I was flying, I still couldn't handle that, but because the airline had invited survivors' families and affected individuals to a memorial ceremony. The plaque was beautiful, understated, bronze with simple lettering, in memory of the 201 souls lost on Flight 447, February 14th, 2019, gone but never forgotten. Amy Walsh was there with Katie, who was now 8 and had lost 2 front teeth since I'd last seen her from a distance. She didn't know who I was, of course. I was just another stranger at another memorial service. But she was wearing a heart-shaped pin on her jacket, homemade, with Mommy written in that same purple crayon I remembered from her drawings. Jennifer's husband, Mike, spoke about how the families had created a scholarship fund in the passengers' names. 186 scholarships for kids who'd lost parents, kids who dreamed of careers in engineering or teaching or art, all the futures the passengers had been pursuing when their plane fell from the sky. I'd contributed to that fund, anonymously, substantially. The settlement money from the airline, plus everything I'd saved from my new job, plus the small inheritance from Mom that I'd never touched. It wasn't atonement. Nothing could bring them back or ease their family's pain, but it was something useful, something that honored their interrupted dreams by helping other dreams continue. After the ceremony, I walked to the memorial garden the families had built, 186 trees, each with a small plaque. I found Jennifer's tree, a cherry blossom that would bloom every spring, pink petals like the dress Katie had worn to her mother's funeral. I kept my promise, I whispered to the tree, feeling both foolish and necessary. I didn't waste it, because that had been my promise, made in countless unsent letters and sleepless nights. If you had to die so I could live, I won't waste this life. I won't hide from it, or squander it, or take it for granted. I'll try to be worthy of the breath you lost. I couldn't save them. I couldn't change the past or explain the cruel mathematics of survival, but I could choose what to do with the future they'd never have. After the ceremony, I walked back to my car. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Proud of you. Mom would be too." For the first time in exactly 1 year, I believed her. I'm writing this 5 years later, on February 14th, 2024, Valentine's Day. The anniversary I used to dread has become something different. Not a celebration, but a remembrance. A day to honor not just the 201 people who died, but the choice to keep living despite the guilt of surviving. I never did get on another plane. Some fears are too deep to overcome, and that's okay. There are other ways to travel, other ways to move through the world. I drove to Seattle last month, took 4 days, stopped at roadside diners and small-town museums and overlooks where you could see forever. Jennifer would have made that trip in 3 hours, but I saw things she never got to see, met people she never got to meet. Different kinds of journeys, both valuable. The nonprofit where I work has grown. We've helped over 3,000 seniors learn to video chat with their families. David Kim's app idea lives on in 1,000 small connections. Grandparents seeing grandchildren's first steps, elderly parents getting virtual hugs from busy adult children. It's not the app he would have built. His would have been more elegant, more innovative, but it serves the same purpose. Love spanning distance, connection defeating isolation. Katie Walsh graduated from high school this year. I know because her Aunt Amy posts pictures sometimes, and I still follow their social media. Not obsessively now, just keeping track. Making sure she's okay, that she's thriving, that Jennifer's daughter is becoming the amazing woman her mother would have wanted her to be. Katie's valedictorian speech was about resilience and how we honor the people we've lost by refusing to let their absence define our lives. She gets it. At 18, she understands something it took me years to learn. I think about parallel universes less now. In most of them, I'm probably dead. In a few, maybe everyone lived. But in this one, the only one that matters, 186 people died so that one coward could learn how to live. The math still doesn't make sense. It never will. But I've stopped trying to solve equations that have no solutions. Instead, I focus on the variables I can control. Showing up, being present, using whatever time I have left to be worthy of the time they lost. Because that's what happens when you're supposed to die but don't. You learn that survival isn't a gift, it's a responsibility. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and work very hard, you learn to carry that responsibility with grace instead of guilt. Sometimes, you even learn to be grateful for the burden. If you've made it this far in the story, if you've stayed with Marcus through his darkest moments and smallest victories, maybe you understand something about second chances, about guilt and grief, and the terrible, beautiful weight of being alive when others aren't. Maybe you're carrying your own survivor's guilt, about opportunities others didn't get, advantages others were denied, simple luck that feels undeserved. Maybe you're struggling with your own version of why me, and now what? Here's what I learned, what Marcus learned, what everyone who survives when others don't eventually has to face. The answer to why me is usually no reason. Random chance, mechanical failure, being too broken to board a plane. Most survival is arbitrary. But the answer to now what? That's where meaning lives. That's where healing happens. That's where we honor the dead by refusing to waste the lives they didn't get to finish. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to save the world or cure cancer or solve all your problems at once. You just have to show up, be present, choose connection over isolation, purpose over despair, living over merely existing. That's enough. Sometimes it's everything. Thank you for reading Marcus's story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of undeserved survival or unearned advantages, remember, the best way to honor what others have lost is to refuse to waste what you have left. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And when you find yourself at your own departure gate, frozen by fear or guilt or the terrible randomness of being alive, remember that choosing to live, choosing to board that plane or stay off it, choosing to keep going when others couldn't, that choice matters. Your story isn't over yet. Thank you for reading Marcus's story.
If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of undeserved survival or unearned advantages, remember, the best way to honor what others have lost is to refuse to waste what you have left. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And when you find yourself at your own departure gate, frozen by fear or guilt or the terrible randomness of being alive, remember that choosing to live, choosing to board that plane or stay off it, choosing to keep going when others couldn't, that choice matters. Your story isn't over yet.